Welcome, everyone. I am Laura Sicking, Manager of Preservation and Outreach at Friends. And before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to let you know that tonight's event will be a little bit different from what we usually do. I see that some of you already have your videos on, so you're welcome to do so. You're welcome to keep them on throughout the talk. Also, you're welcome to ask questions via the chat, but you can also raise your virtual hand, not your actual hand, to ask a question. And just be mindful that you'll have to confirm unmuting before you speak. The raise hand function is at the bottom of your screen under the reactions button. I'm very happy to see a few familiar faces and names tonight, but if you're new here, Friends is an almost 40-year-old organization dedicated to the preservation and celebration of the architectural legacy, livability, and sense of place of the Upper East Side. And a lot of that sense of place comes from the small businesses in our neighborhood. That's where Betsy Bober-Pallavi comes in. Betsy is a writer, of course, and she also owned a children's bookstore while she lived in Westchester. I'll let her tell you the story behind her Manhattan Sideways project. But I will add that Betsy is a wonderful storyteller and that her recent book is filled with heartwarming stories about the small businesses that live in our neighborhood and our city. Betsy, all yours.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and welcome to all of you. So that was a great introduction, and now I can elaborate on it. And I am happy for you to interrupt me anytime. This is very informal. And otherwise, I'll pause as I'm speaking so that you can ask questions. First, we're doing a slideshow. These are some of the magnificent photos that are in my book. I am not the photographer, so I can say that they are truly wonderful. Okay, so I lived in Manhattan for 5 years, and after being married, and then we decided to move up to Westchester and have children. And while there, I came up with a brilliant idea to open a children's bookstore, which I had for 10 years and loved every moment of it. And then for 15 more years, I worked with authors and illustrators, helping to promote their books and traveling all over the country with them, and having them speak at schools and libraries and all kinds of other venues, not on Zoom in those days. So we raised our son and daughter in Westchester. And then when they were out of the house, we decided it was time to move back into Manhattan. And I had to sell my book business. And it didn't take me long to realize that I desperately needed to come up with something constructive and creative to do with my time. And I started walking on all the side streets, and I started collecting business cards and having conversations with the business owners. And it was just swirling around in my head that I wanted to walk all the side streets. I wanted to meet all the business owners. I wanted to give all of them a voice. I wanted to help them. I wanted to give them more exposure. And perhaps having owned my own small business, I understood what it was like to run a business and how much of our heart and soul had to go into it to keep it going every single day. So my kids came to visit, and we were having dinner one night, and I threw out this crazy idea to them and said, I have this idea of wanting to walk all the streets in Manhattan, the side streets, to get off the avenues and to discover. And I somehow want to do this with the idea of helping other small businesses. And they immediately jumped on it, and they thought it was brilliant. And they said they wanted to make me a website. And this was back in 2011. And my husband, wonderful man that he is, said, if you wait for me on the weekends when I'm not working, I'll walk with you too. And I said, well, that's lovely, but A, I want something to do Monday to Friday, and B, I'll never get done if I just do it on the weekends. But yes, please plan to join me on the weekends. So my kids told me I needed to start on First Street and I needed to have an end street. And I had to go in chronological order from the East River to the Hudson. So my husband and I had been invited to the opening of the original Manhattan grid. It was an exhibition at the Museum of the City of New York. And we both went and looked at this map tilted sideways of the city of Manhattan sideways. And we both looked at each other and said, that's it. And the original Manhattan grid started on First Street, river to river, and ended on 155th. So I had my endpoint. And honestly, I mean, besides no one else believing I would do it, I really never thought I would do it. But for 6 years, I started on First and I walked every single side street in Manhattan up until 155th Street. And I documented every single place, met as many possible business owners, managers, etc., that I could. The website came out 1 year later in 2012, and I had reached about 10th Street at that point. And I would go in and I'd introduce myself and I would conduct interviews. And then I worked with photographers who would join me on another time and take photos. And I walked every street multiple times. I walked it in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, on the weekends. I biked 155 streets as well because I felt I was seeing things a little differently from just that little bit of elevation when one sits on a bike. And all these years, I keep going back street after street after street because, as you all know, sadly, places close, but also new places open. So we were always adding and subtracting on the website, but it has become a wonderful resource for people to use. It has every parking garage, every synagogue, church, every beautiful community garden, a tattoo parlor, hair salons. I mean, anything you can think of that's non-residential is on the website. So after 6 years, my husband said to me, now you need to turn this into a book. You need to memorialize your journey. Well, in addition to having owned a bookstore, my mom is an acclaimed award-winning biographer. So books were so much in my blood, and I always wanted to write a book. I just never knew the exact approach to writing a book and how could I put 6 years of walking 155 streets into a book. And then the pandemic hit last March and it became a no-brainer for me. And I said, I love these business owners. The whole point of what I've done is to help them, and they need my help and your help more than ever now. And I decided I was going to self-publish. I had spoken with some publishers, but everybody had a different vision than the one that I had. And also it takes time when you work with a big company. So my husband was wonderful and helped me, and we figured out how one self-publishes a book. And in 6 months' time, it was at a printer, a small family-owned 4-generation printing company in Illinois, which was exactly up my alley. Those were the kinds of businesses I loved to spend time with and wanted to help. And they walked me through every single step of the way. And we have a beautiful book now, which I'm very proud of. And it has done extremely well, and it has brought tears, happy tears and smiles to so many business owners' faces, and also business for them. So I feel like I've achieved something that in my heart of hearts was all I ever wanted to do. I'm going to stop in a second for any questions or comments before I then would love to share so many wonderful stories about these people, heart-wrenching and heartwarming. So the goal of the website, obviously, in addition to wanting just to give exposure and celebrate all these wonderful businesses, was to get all of you, to get New Yorkers out and to walk a different walk. If you are used to every day going on 71st Street to get to work or to the restaurant or to the cleaners or whatever you were doing, walk a different street and check out and find a bakery 1 block north of you that so many people will say, oh, I never knew that was there. I always go the same way. We're all guilty of it. And so I wanted to motivate people to not only explore their own neighborhood, but if you live on the Upper East Side and it's a beautiful weekend and you are thinking about what do I want to do, go to the East Village, go to Harlem, go to the Upper West Side and walk on the side streets and find these incredible places that you otherwise never knew about. People coming from the tri-state area, when people would come in to go to theater or to the museums, and I would always say, yes, do all these wonderful things, be a tourist. But if you really want to know New York, you need to meet the people. And the way to meet the people is to walk on the side streets and drop by and say hello and start a conversation and hear their stories. And people coming from abroad, and goodness, we all hope they'll be back soon. Same thing. And the book I have been shipped. So in that I self-published it. It is not on Amazon. I chose to do everything myself. So it's in my apartment, and every night my husband and I get them ready, and we the post office comes by and picks them up every morning. And those that are deliverable in Manhattan, we deliver ourselves. But we have shipped to Australia, to Austria, to the Netherlands, to Scotland, Ireland, London, Canada, Amsterdam. And almost every state, not Hawaii or Alaska, but almost every state in the country. So I feel people are living vicariously. They can't travel, but they want to feel like they're in New York. They want to learn about New York, and this seems to be a terrific way for them to do it. So I'm going to pause now, and I would love to answer questions or any comments that anyone would like to make. Or not.
Sorry, as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, you can do so via chat. We do have a question for Kathy's, and I think I can respond to that. She's asking only East Side Street. No, she went west and east from river to river, right, Betsy?
East River to the Hudson River, every single street. Yeah.
So to start the questions, I have one. Do you have a favorite street?
People ask that a lot, and it's kind of like asking about a favorite child, because I found something compelling and fascinating everywhere I went. And I had interns every summer, and I would always say to them, look up. Or even if you're in Times Square and it's literally 100 degrees outside and there's a million people in the middle of Times Square, just stop and look and take it in and say, oh my gosh, there's people from all over the world in our city, and just absorb it for a few minutes and see the architecture and on these side streets. I will say that when people call me, text me, email me all the time. I mean, I even got to set up my son's date nights, and he married one of them, who I adore. And the East Village, 7th Street and 9th Street, and of course, St. Mark's Place, those in particular, because they have so many small businesses, that's all they are, mom and pop businesses. There are no chain stores there. And so when you go down 9th Street, if you're with your children, there's a few stores for them, toy stores and clothing stores. There's a beer shop, there's a sake shop, there's a lot of vintage, there's men's clothing. There's a sporting, it's called Mr. Throwback, and it's such fun. And he has all old sporting paraphernalia, Mets jackets and T-shirts and jerseys, and from all the teams, obviously an emphasis placed on New York, but from all the teams. And there's just something fun to be found everywhere. And of course, amazing food on that street. And the same with 7th Street. So on 8th Street, which is St. Mark's Place, that one is just filled with so much history from the 60s and 70s, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And many of those businesses are still there. And there's always characters, in the best sort of way, characters on St. Mark's Place. So that's a really fun one. But then when I talk to you about all these different stories, I'll share other streets with you. How's that?
Sounds good. Another question is, what was there a theme to the most type of stories you found, or kind of like a theme of stores? So which was the most common type of store or side business that you found, or wasn't there one?
Well, I guess my book is divided into 15 chapters. So I guess I found those themes and then was able to translate them into the book. The most businesses that have, so the book is about the businesses that have stood the test of time, 30 years or older for the first book. The second book will be the 1990s and older. Italian restaurants. There are more Italian restaurants in Manhattan than anything else that have survived the test of time. And when I say that, I mean some of them 100 years, like fourth generation, early 1900s, or 1920s, I should say. Some of them opened, which I found fascinating. So my favorite are the immigrant stories and the third and fourth generation. And I can't begin to tell you how many times I've met people, young people, and they're even in their 30s, who said this was my grandpa's. True Fabric is one of them on West 25th Street. And it was, his grandpa came from Russia and worked for a velvet company, and then the store became, then he moved to this store and the store became available, and so he decided to purchase it, and it has been there since the 1940s, I think. And the mom, the grandpa and the grandma would work in the store. The grandma passed away, and then the mom started helping her dad, and then the grandson started going in. And when the grandfather passed away, he said, I never thought I would do this. I thought I was going to study business and be out there in the business world. But he said, this was my grandpa's. How could I let it close? And he's been running it for many years now. So very sweet, very, very sweet. And that kind of story, especially in the garment district, there's another store on 30th in the 30s that it's a similar story. And the father didn't take it over, but the grandson took it over. And those are heartwarming, as we say. Yeah. Does that answer a little bit?
I think it does, and I completely relate to those stories. We have a hand up from Jackie. I'm going to ask you to unmute. You probably have to confirm that.
I think she did.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
A couple of questions. Are these all storefront places? You didn't go in buildings and upstairs too, or just?
That's a very good question. And I did. And there are some that are not on the ground floor. Either I had heard about them, I discovered them because they had, do you know, sandwich boards, the little boards that's outside. So sometimes I would see those. So, and it would say 9th floor. There's a chocolate shop, actually, Modern Chocolate on the 9th floor. And chocolate, well, I went up there. So they're in the book. And I went into basements, and if I saw little arrows, I stopped at nothing. I was fearless for 155 streets. And I went into some places, let's say my family wasn't really happy. I did, but it all turned out fine. I never, ever had a bad experience. And maybe I'll share some of my funny encounters with you in a bit. So what was the second question?
The other question, and I'm thinking this would have depended on the situation and the store, but how did you introduce yourself or present yourself? Was it as a customer, or I'm writing a book, or how did you go about entree?
Very good question. It took me a while to get up the nerve to explain what I was doing. So for the first, let's say 20 blocks, I was just collecting business cards, which I now have over 10,000 business cards. Yeah, and they are the end pages of my book. So I put them to good use. So I just kind of made conversation, got to know people, and then I would go back and then I would call all the places and tell them what I was doing. But then after I'd been out there for a good year or two, I got more confidence and I had something to show them. You know, I could show them on my phone, this is the website, and they could appreciate what I was doing. I did have many encounters where people didn't trust what I was doing. And many people said, how much does this cost? Or, you know, they thought I was soliciting them and wanted to advertise. I found up in Harlem where I had a particularly difficult language barrier because so many people up there were speaking Spanish. And I was always walking with my little pad and a pen. And I found out from somebody who went with me one day who was fluent in Spanish that they thought I was either from the health department or from immigration. And so that was why they were hesitant. But once they found out who I was and what I was doing, then they were happy, of course, to welcome me and to talk to me. So yeah, I wasn't met with resistance ultimately, you know, initially, but I, you know, had to persuade some people. And if they were reluctant and they didn't want to talk to me, you know, that was fine. I never wanted to make anyone uncomfortable. And I learned a lot of places that sell particularly things for your cell phone, which was interesting. They're not really Verizon stores or whatever, you know, there's other things going on there. And so, you know, and some of them were very honest with me and said, please don't put me on there because I'm illegal. And I said, you got it. And I didn't. And I will tell you, if you want an interesting, funny story, don't be horrified. I went into a place one day where you asked me, how did I find some of these places? I saw this little sign and it said travel on it. And it had a little arrow, but I didn't see anywhere. And I went down these steps and then I opened a door and I walked down somewhat of a dark hall. And at the end of the hall, it was a dark purple velvet curtain. So I just moved the curtain over and in there were about 4 or 5 men. And one of them was laying out on a table and had basically no clothes on. And they said, come in. And I'm like, oh, I think I'm good, but thanks so much. And I left. And I found out that they were a tattoo parlor. And I left. And I was with my photographer one day and we were walking past this shop. And I said, will you do me this favor? I need to go in again, but I'll feel more comfortable if you're with me. And we went down there. And they remembered me, of course, right away. I was the one who turned bright red and come in. So this time we did, and it ends up that they're very, very famous as tattoo people. People come from all over to have them work on them. And the reason that they're so hidden is that they're across the street from a junior high school. And they asked me not to put their address in because it's illegal for these kids to come in and they didn't want to deal with it. And so I said to them, I just need to ask you, the gentleman who was lying down, who was there that day, I remembered him. And I said, you had such beautiful artwork on your chest. And I said, is there any way that we, you know, this photographer who was with me could see it? And he lifts up his shirt. He says, of course. And I said, how about us photographing it? And the photographer was like appalled by me. How could you ask that? And I said, because, you know, you got to ask, right? And he said, yes, please put it on your website. And so we got these beautiful photos of this gentleman who, I mean, it really was stunning and it was all different colors. So I guess, I hope I don't horrify you, but that's my worst, I guess, story to tell you. Everything else was, you know, nothing like that. But you don't learn, you don't meet people, and you don't hear their stories if you don't ask. So I did. That's what I did. And somebody asked me when I was doing a Zoom talk, she said, Betsy, we all wake up every morning and we say, we're going to do this today, or we have a long range plan that we're going to accomplish this or that. She said, but who gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to walk 155 streets, but then actually does it? And she said, my one question is, what motivated you? What got you to keep going? And I need to emphasize this to all of you. It was the people that I met. I met extraordinary New Yorkers. I heard their stories over and over. I never tired of them. And then I got to write about them. And then I got to share them. And then I got to put them in a book. And now I get to tell you about it. So, I mean, what better? What better? It was the best so far 11 years I've ever had. Is that?
Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Terrific.
Anyone else? Or should I tell some stories? What would you like?
Actually, we have a lot more questions.
Sure.
So Seth just raised their hand, and it's gonna be the last question for now, and then we'll move on and we'll have questions later. I am going to ask you to unmute.
Yeah,
There you
Betsy,
go.
I got two questions. How many businesses are mentioned in the book? How many did you cover in the book?
175.
And how many did you leave out? I mean, it must have been a lot.
9,000.
Oh my God. But are you still in touch with these people? They sound amazing people. You were in touch with them.
Oh, yes. I said I'm one of the few New Yorkers who can say I have hundreds of friends, and I really do. And a lot of these Zoom talks that I've been doing, I have a business owner, 2 or 3 join me. And
Wow.
so for 6-7 years now, I've been working with Google. They have found out about about Manhattan Sideways years ago and reached out and said, our goal is to get our people out of the office, to have them socialize and make friends with one another, and to support small businesses. Google has always wanted to support small businesses.
Wow.
And they said, you sound like the perfect person to help us to do that. So for years and years, every month I organize what I called sidewalk events, because I'm not a tour guide. And I would bring hundreds, not at a time, because a lot of the businesses were too small, 40 to 50 at a time, but multiple times every month, into all the businesses. And we would go to different neighborhoods. We'd eat well, drink well, but we'd go to a cultural place, a historic place, and then all these fun little shops. And so I really got to know all the business owners, and I brought them business. So that was a nice thing. And people would always go back. I made these maps that I handed out to everybody, and they would collect them. And then when friends and relatives came to visit from out of town, and Googlers are from all over the world, so there was an array of people visiting, and they would take them to visit these places. So that was gratifying for me. Then when the pandemic hit, I had to cancel last March and April that I had already organized, but then Google came to me and said, can we make this happen virtually? So since last May, I've been doing this and bringing the business owners on via computer, and they've been teaching classes, lots of cooking, bead making, flower arranging, just all kinds of fun things that they're called Googlers, that the Googlers get to sign up for and participate in for an hour. It's a break during their day. So I feel really good about it. And we really are helping the businesses because Google pays them very nicely. So,
so you must have a lot of books in you yet to come out with those other companies, right? I mean, you can make more books, right? I imagine.
I'm working really hard now, and the second one will be out October 1st. And
super.
The second one, in addition to lots more just small regular businesses, I always wanted to give a shout out to the or they don't like to be called nonprofit, the not-for-profits. There are so many incredible places that we don't, as regular New Yorkers or outside of New York, know about. You walk past them, you see their signs perhaps, but it wouldn't occur to you to learn who they are and why they're doing what they're doing. So I think this will be an eye-opener for many. The book will also include the arts. So small theaters on the side streets, dance companies, lots in the but in the art world, galleries, etc. And then there's my biggest struggle is a chapter devoted to churches and synagogues, mosques, etc. on the side streets. And everyone knows St. Patrick's and a few others, but it is extraordinary what magnificent houses of worship are on the side streets of
Wow.
the city. In Harlem alone, on the side streets, there's over 150 churches. Just in Harlem, from 100 to 155th Street. That's just unbelievable. And nobody knows that, except the people who document it, I guess. But so anyway, so I think that volume 2 should be fun to look at and beautiful, beautiful photographs.
Thank you, Betsy. Fabulous, really.
Thank you. Would you like me to share some of my particularly favorite stories? I mean, there's so many, and most of you, I think, are on the Upper East Side, and certainly there are plenty to talk about there. So the book, yes, there are some very famous places in it, but it really is showcasing what I call the businesses that go under the radar, that people don't normally know about. And to me, those are the true, what I say is the true fabric of our city. So right near some of you is Jim Lee Cleaners. That was Barbetta, the oldest Italian restaurant in New York. And that's her too, that photo. Okay, so Jim Lee Cleaners, when my summer interns would rewalk the streets for me while I kept working my way north, they were always starting on First Street and making sure that we were keeping the site up to date. And then I asked them, I hadn't thought of this initially, it was to find out what date businesses were established. And so when I was looking through somebody's notes one day, I saw Jim Lee Cleaners 1928. And so I said, well, I'm not going to bother her. It's probably a typo. I'll just call to make sure myself. And I called and a woman answered and I asked her what year Jim Lee's opened. And she said 1928. And I said, really? And I remember it so well. She said, do you want to speak to the owner? And I said, I absolutely do. And David got on the phone and it was his grandfather's. His grandfather came from China and the family lived in the laundry itself. Ultimately, they were able to move upstairs to live. He was able to bring his son Eugene over, and then Eugene worked in the shop, and then Eugene went to fight in World War II for America, and then went back to China to find a wife, came back to help his dad, and this is where David was raised. And David now has 3 grown children, 2 are attorneys, and he said they're never going to work here. He said, but I made a living. I was able to put my 3 kids through college and grad school, and I'm very proud. And that's right in your neighborhood, and that's probably a Cleaners that you walk past all the time and would never stop to think that there's a story behind it. And then Maz Mescal, M-A-Z, Maz Mescal, like the tequila, is on 86th Street since the 1960s. Now, this is an unbelievable story, and this one will definitely bring tears to your eyes. And I just beg you to go there and support her. So Maria grew up in Indiana in a little tiny farm town, and she was 16 years old, and she was out with her older sister one late afternoon, and they saw a car on the side of the road, and they stopped to say, can we help you? And 2 men in uniform, 1960s, got out of the car and said they had run out of gas. So the 2 girls offered to drive them to the nearest gas station, which was miles and miles away. And afterwards, Eduardo asked Maria if he could take her out on a date one night. He was only there for a few days, and then he was going to be sent off to Vietnam. So he came, he met her parents, and they said she could go out with him. And they spent a few days together, and then he left. For 2 years, they wrote letters to each other. When he came back from Vietnam, he went to Indiana and asked her to marry him. She was 18 years old. She had never left Indiana. She had never eaten in a restaurant. She had never been in an airplane, and she did not speak Spanish whatsoever. He brought her to New York City, and they moved in with his parents. His mother never spoke a word of English to her. She was determined that this young girl had to learn Spanish, and threw her into the restaurant world because the parents owned a Mexican restaurant. They then went on to open Mas Mezcal, and it has been there since the 1960s, and she and her husband ran it together. After 25 years of marriage, they were thinking about retiring, selling the restaurant. Maybe they'd had enough. And oh, right there she is. That's them. They got pregnant and they had little Gabby. And so they said, well, now we have to keep working. And they lived across the street, and Gabby was raised in the restaurant, and all the people, all the employers there were part of their family, and their children and grandchildren now work there. And very, very sadly, Eduardo passed away from COVID this summer. And that was just, as I say, heartbreaking, heart-wrenching. Just, it was such a wonderful, wonderful love story. And Maria lost her husband, the love of her life, and Gabby lost her daddy. And Maria also got COVID and was very, very ill, but recovered. But then she recently was in the hospital again, and they said that what was wrong with her was all repercussions from COVID. So she's doing okay, trying to get her strength back. But Mas Mezcal is a fantastic Mexican restaurant. They have a beautiful garden in the back. They have it all set up on 86th Street to eat outdoors. So if you like Mexican food, I beg you, I urge you to please visit them. So now, okay, let me stop and see if there's questions or comments. Sorry.
Yes, we do still have a few leftover questions, so I'm just gonna go through them, and maybe we'll see if we have some hands raised. And going to the restaurant, since you just spoke about the Mexican restaurant, how many different cuisines did you try? Do you have any idea?
Everything. There's a Somali restaurant. There's only one. I'm a vegetarian, so it made it a little uncomfortable whenever we would, so I would go, I would meet the owners, I would hear their story, I would explain who I was, and then I would set up appointments to come back with the photographer. And most of the time they would want to cook dishes for us to photograph, and many a time they would say, sit down and eat it and enjoy it. So I did have my uncomfortable moments because I never wanted to offend someone. They made these beautiful dishes. So I learned to, if I had, the photographer with me, then he or she was perfectly happy to have anything. So that worked out well. But I kind of let them know early on, and not because I wanted them to make me something to eat, more that I wanted them to understand that I wasn't going to eat something. But yes, we ate very, very well. And my favorite part besides, of course, meeting the people, but my favorite activity was going in the kitchens. Oh my goodness, what an experience to go in the back. And I could tell you, there were a few where I would say, I don't want to eat here. But for the most part, they were all, deserved to have a letter A from the health department. And but just to watch how it all works, to see sometimes 30 people in unison making dishes and watching them go down the line, and what you see in the movies and on TV, it really is what happens. And to see the knives and the chopping blocks, and to go inside these humongous refrigerators and freezers, and to be there on a delivery day and to see all the fresh fruits and vegetables coming in, and that I loved that.
That's good. Did you include or visited and have it in your website, firehouses, police stations, libraries?
Yes, and yes, every single one. And thank you for saying that, because without a doubt, hands down, the kindest people overall that I met were the firemen. And I never met a firewoman until one day there's a firehouse museum in Tribeca. And there's a woman there who works there who's a retired firewoman. But otherwise, I never met a woman. I did meet a Dalmatian that was 13 years old, the only one that was left in the city. I devoted a chapter of my book to the firehouses. I just needed to give them a shout out and to say thank you for all that you do. So there is a chapter in there about the firehouses on the side streets.
Mm.
The police, I was not invited into any police headquarters. That was, not allowed.
Makes sense.
Mhm.
So do you have any plans of either expanding to other places in Manhattan or doing a cross-borough project in other boroughs of the city?
I'm asked that all the time. I was asked to come to London and to Chicago. I love what I did. I love what I'm doing, and it's a never ending responsibility in the most wonderful possible ways, because the city is forever changing. And I can't wait to re-walk the streets. I'm hoping sometime this summer to virtually hug all these business men and women who are back, and to mourn the ones that have closed and to welcome the new ones. There are a lot of new businesses opening, and I applaud them, and I want to see them do well, so I want to help them. So I think I still have my work cut out for me, and I'm not tired or sick of it or bored of it. I love it, and I think it's who I am. When my husband and I were moving 5 years ago, we were living uptown and we needed to move, and we were looking at different places, and I was looking at on Street Easy, and I was finding places on the avenue, and he looked at me and he said, "Betsy, you can never live on the avenue." He said, "We have to live on a side street, and we have to live between First and 155th. I said, "Okay, you're right. So I am devoted to what I do, and I'm not doing this for any financial reasons. So maybe if I was, looking to build some sort of an empire or to make money on my books, but no, everything I do, I put back into helping the businesses. So I'm very happy with what I do. Yeah.
Good. All right. Let me see. Did you discover any little known museums through your ways?
And there's a chapter for the new book on those exact places. Yeah. What should I tell you? The Merchant House Museum is several hundred years old, and the city, they keep fighting. It's on East 4th. It was a family that lived there, and the house is exactly as it was. I have to look up the year for you, but at least like a good 200 years old. And the clothing and the bedding, and there's all these things still in this house. It's just incredible. And the city keeps knocking everything down around it. And I don't know if any of you know the book Little House by Kate Burton, or Mike Mulligan's Steam Shovel, where everything is knocked down, but the house stays in place. And they build it was in the country, and they build a whole city around this little house because the little house won't move. That's what I feel like about many of these places. And they want them to be landmarked so that nobody can touch them. But yet now they keep talking about building a hotel. And when they start digging, and the house is so old that it could shatter the house. I mean, it's that vulnerable. So that's one example. Hope I could tell you lots more. Anyone also, you can call me, text me, email me, and we can share all that at the end. And I am happy to tell you all kinds of information about things that you're particularly interested in.
Yeah, that book was one of my favorite books when I was a child.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I think we can leave questions for a little bit later if you want to talk a little bit more, or if we're done or we want to do more questions, it's up to you.
I think I have two really wonderful stories. I'll try to tell them as quickly as I can so I don't take too much of your time. And then there are just these what I call hidden gems where like people who are hobbyists and that you would have no idea that these places, maybe I'll do that first for you. So on the Upper East Side where you are, I'm assuming most of you have heard of the Tiny Doll House, which is a dollhouse shop. And he makes a lot of the things. Was traveling all over the world to find miniature of anything and everything you could think of. And he custom makes doll houses. This is a 3-generation photo that I love. It's just such a fun place to go into. And he started doing fairly well after COVID broke out because people were home and moms and dads thought, what an interesting, fun hobby to start our kids on. So they were buying doll houses to either make or to fill. NY Cake, for any of you who are bakers on West 22nd Street, it's like going with a shopping cart up and down the aisle of a food store, but every single thing in the shop is devoted to baking. Anything that you could possibly think of to decorate or to make, the tools, different sprinkles and icings, and it's just so much fun, and it's all about baking. The Red Caboose Hobby Shop is on West 45th Street. And if any of you have, as a child, had electric trains or your own children had electric trains, he's the last one standing, and he sells all the parts, and he has people from all over the world contacting him, and it's so much fun. And that's another one where there was the little sandwich board outside, and I said, oh, what is that? And I went down the steps and into the basement, and in this tiny little shop I met this lovely man who is completely devoted to electric trains and models, all kinds of models, like car models. And I bought my grandson a model, his first model for him to make. In the East Village there's Casey's Stamps, so rubber stamps. That's a real bird. That's in a barber shop on West 55th Street. He's the Upper East Side. He fixes clocks and watches. This is the East Side too. Suzanne Millinery, the hat shop. So Casey Stamps, he carves out of wood and rubber, and he makes any stamp that you could imagine. So if you need one of an alligator or a flower, or you are starting a business and you want something with your name on it, so he can make you stamps. And these are all tiny little places where 2 and 3 people are plenty in there. So that's just to give you a quick overview. There's so many more, but Flower Power, she's one of the very first people to have an herbal shop before herbs were an in thing in the 1980s. This is Jim's Shoe Repair on the Upper East Side. He's been there a long time, 4 generations now. So I'm just going to tell you my 2 stories that people seem to always love and say to me, you have to make sure you always share them. So what I didn't tell, Lulu Buttons, that's another, my mom always says I have to tell you Lulu Buttons story, so I've got to talk fast. After 6 years of walking, my husband was with me one weekend, and I was in so much pain, and I said, I can't walk anymore. And he said, you're the Energizer Bunny, what's wrong? And I said, I don't know. And we went back, and on Monday I went to the orthopedist, and he said, Betsy, you broke your foot. And he said, you broke it 100% just from walking. And you have to be in a cast, and you have to be on crutches, and you have to be off it for 6 to 8 weeks. So I said, no, that's not happening. At that point, I was up to the 130s. I only had about 20 blocks until I reached my goal, the end of the Manhattan grid. So I continued, and I did it on crutches, and there's a picture of me on 155th Street on crutches when I reached the finish line. So my husband was with me, and we I crutched across to Riverside Drive, and there was this garden, and I saw these two young women bending down, working, and I excused myself and asked, could they talk to me? And, I love community gardens, and, could I learn about it? And they said, today's your lucky day, hold on. And they went and they brought Jenny, and the garden is called Jenny's Garden. And Jenny was 81 at the time. And she saw me on crutches, and she said to me, honey, I'm busy. It's a Saturday. It's a beautiful day, but you crutched all the way over here. I'm going to speak to you. And she said, come sit on my bench. And she sat with me for an hour, and she told me her story. So she and her husband came here from Puerto Rico some 40, 50 years ago at this point. And they had 4 children, and they lived on Riverside Drive. And if you're familiar, it's way up high. The apartments are raised up high. So she lived on the 4th floor, and she said that she needed a place for her 4 children to play. And across the street, there was this park, but it was filled with drug addicts and homeless people. And this is in the 1970s. And so every day she would go down, she'd bring them some food, and she would chat with them, and she befriended them all. She said, one by one, I moved them all out until it was empty. And then I started planting. And this is in the 1980s. And she planted from 138th Street now up until 143rd Street is the most magnificent garden. It is filled with every kind of tree, every kind of vegetable, fruit that you could possibly imagine. And if you're not familiar with community gardens, everyone is different. There's a lot of them in the East Village, but they all started in the 70s and early 80s to help people, so they would pay a few dollars a year, and they'd have a small plot of land, and they could plant whatever they wanted, and that could feed them for the summer. So some of her property was done that way, where people could pay, and then you also had to help with other people's property plots. So she had this community of people always out there helping her. And there's a beautiful butterfly garden, like 140, I would say, walking up there. So it's so special just to walk through, and beautiful paths. So I said to Jenny, I have 2 questions for you. First, how did you water the plants? And so she pointed up to her apartment on the 4th floor, and she said, I bought a hose, I attached it to my sink, I fed it through my window, then I ran downstairs, I grabbed it, I walked across the street, Riverside Drive, if you can picture that, and I watered my plants. And she said, I did that for years and years until the city finally got wind of what was happening here, and they came and they put a water system in for her. And I said, my second question for you, Jenny, is there is an abundance of fruit and vegetables here. I said, who eats all this? Who gets all of this? And she said, I give it to the homeless. So she had my heart. From the day she met those people, she's given back to them. So I just think that's a beautiful story. And very sadly, Jenny passed away right before COVID. So I miss her. So, and now, how am I doing? I don't want to keep you longer than you want to be here. So tell me, should I stop, or what would you like?
I think it's a raise of hands if people would like. I'm amazed by the stories you're telling. So if there is any other specific one you like that you'd like to tell, and then we can have a few more Q&A. That'd be good.
I will do 2 more. I told you my mom always says this is her favorite story. Lulu Buttons is on 38th Street near where Lord and Taylor used to be. He, in the 1970s, lived in Iran, and he, at age 17, quietly applied to university in America, and he got into Brooklyn Tech, and he went to his mom and said, I got into a college in America and I would like to go. And his mom said to him, where is America? And she didn't read, she didn't write, and they had no money whatsoever. And the next day she took a few of her special possessions and she went and she sold them. And she came back to him and said, you go follow your dream. And he came to America. And he graduated, got his engineering degree, and was working for a construction company on Fifth Avenue. And during his lunch hour one day, he walked into a button store and he found a few buttons that he liked and wanted to purchase them. And the person behind the counter said it would be several weeks or months before any would be available. And he looked at the buttons and said, I can make these buttons. And he left the store and he left his job. And today he has, it's a tiny little store. However, he makes buttons for the Metropolitan Opera, New York City Ballet. He said pretty much every Broadway show has a button of his on it. He was the person, unbeknownst to him, who made the buttons for Meghan Markle's mother for Prince Harry's and Meghan's wedding. And the way he found out was he saw them on television and remembered the people coming into his store talking about something and not really understanding what it was, but that they had bought these very expensive buttons or asked him to make these very expensive buttons. And then he saw them on TV. So that was an exciting moment for him. So that's just a wonderful immigrant story. That woman is quite a character. And then my last one that I'll share with you, because it's such a happy one. There's a store on 120th Street called Grandma's Place. And I was walking on 120th, and it was this beautiful street lined with stunning brownstones. And then I saw a sign that said Grandma's Place, Toys and Books. Well, I owned a toy and bookstore, so primarily bookstore. Of course I had to go in, and I have 3 grandchildren, so of course I had to go in. So I went in and I introduced myself to the owner, to the gentleman behind the counter, and he said, oh, you need to meet Grandma Dawn. So he said, go next door and knock on the door, and I'm going to call her and tell her you're coming. And I went over, and there was Grandma Dawn, and she was sitting in her grandmother's rocking chair, which was over 100 years old. And Grandma Dawn at the time was well into her 70s. I guess she's 81 now. And she said, sit down. And she told me her whole story. She was one of the first people to win the lottery in the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. And she got this dilapidated, rundown brownstone on 120th Street. And the city gave her a $75,000 loan to fix it up. She raised her children and her granddaughters. Her own 2 daughters and her granddaughters in this house, and has been there ever since. She was the daughter of a barber and what she calls a chambermaid. And her parents were never home. And her older sister, every day when she was going to be left alone, would drop her at the library. And Dawn taught herself to read. And she said when she graduated from the children's section, she was still very young, so the librarians had to be very careful as they moved her up what she was reading. But she said, I traveled the world through books. And she said, I always wanted to give that opportunity to other children. And when she was 40, she won a scholarship and got to go to Sarah Lawrence and got a college degree. She was a teacher for some 40 years up in Harlem, and she always collected books. And when I tell you, the bathroom was to the ceiling with books, like you couldn't move in the bathroom, like everywhere there are books. She gives them all away. So she had next door, she rented the space, and she had a literacy center going on. And she was not only helping children to read, but she was helping adults learn to read and write. But she wasn't able to sustain it. So she decided she needed to turn it into a book and toy shop. And she's been there for about 30 years, and she is Grandma Dawn. Everybody in the neighborhood calls her Grandma and just loves her. So during COVID, I've been in touch with her a lot, and she was struggling and she wasn't sure what was going to happen. And I was fortunate enough to be contacted by NBC, and they wanted to do an interview with me. And we went to a few shops in the Chelsea Flatiron areas where we ended up. And the woman who interviewed me said, Betsy, you have such great stories. Where should I go? I want to interview more people. And I said, you have to meet Grandma Dawn. The next week she went up. Grandma Dawn told her story. She said, I'm $17,000 in debt, and I'm going to have to close in the next few months. And this woman called a friend of hers who's what we call an influencer, where on social media, he has over 1 million followers. He came from Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, all the way up to Harlem, met her, heard her story, and right then and there started a GoFundMe page, which invites people to donate to anyone they would like to donate. And within about 2.5, 3 weeks, they had raised $46,000 for this woman. So now not only is she able to keep her bookstore alive, people are coming from everywhere. She's been on every TV network and in newspapers telling her story. And now she's buying a bookmobile, and she's going to drive around Harlem and give out books to children. So I hope that ends on a happy note for all of you.
That is indeed a very happy note. Like I told you the first time I heard you talk, it really touched me, and I ordered the book right away.
Oh.
For everyone that wants the book, the link to purchase it is on the chat, and you can find it. You can email me if you can't find the link on the chat, and I'll send you the link and the link to Betsy's website. If anyone has any last questions, that's your chance to raise your hand. But Betsy, thank you so much for doing this talk and for doing what you do, for going up and down the side streets and collecting this amazing stories from this wonderful businesses that really do and live in our streetscape and are part of what our city is.
To know the people is to know New York. And even if you can't go and visit these places, please reach out to them if any of these stories touched you, or if you read the book and something inspires you. Just show them love. One of the restaurants, an Italian restaurant, he does very well. They own the building. It's 4 generations now. And he said, Betsy, it's not always just about the finances. He said, I miss the people. I miss the hugs. I miss cooking for them, the conversation. They want to hear from you. They want to hear your love, feel your love. Yeah.
Well, Betsy, thank you so much. And thank you everyone that joined, and I'll see you next time.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all for participating.
Okay.